Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 17 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode, the HMS Resolution left Dusky Bay and began sailing northward along the rugged coast of New Zealand's South Island. As they advanced, the climate grew milder, the sea teemed with birds, and the landscape slowly transformed, high cliffs giving way to flatter shores. But just as nature seemed to ease its grip, the sailors encountered one of its most dramatic displays: waterspouts. Towering columns of swirling mist linked sky and sea, spinning across the ocean's surface and sending chills down even the most seasoned sailors' spines. Their mysterious power, still poorly understood at the time, reminded all aboard of the unpredictable dangers of the South Pacific. Finally, as they rounded the northern tip of the South Island, hope returned. Flashes from the shore revealed the long-missed HMS Adventure waiting in Queen Charlotte Sound. A joyful reunion followed. Cannon fire echoed across the bay. Officers exchanged greetings and gifts, and both crews celebrated their survival after months apart. Together again, they shared news, food, and fresh discoveries, ready to face whatever challenges the Pacific still had in store.
Saturday, May 22nd, 1773, Queen Charlotte Sound, New Zealand.
Today, they went to an island in the sound that Captain Cook had named Long Island on his previous voyage. It consisted of a long mountain ridge, very steep on both sides, but almost completely flat on top, though narrow in most places. On the northwest side, they found a beautiful beach, and above it a small flat area, mostly swampy and covered with various types of grass. The rest of the land was full of anti-scorbutic herbs and New Zealand flax, which grew most abundantly near the old abandoned huts of the inhabitants. They had some plots of land dug and prepared and sowed European garden seeds, which, by all appearances, would grow well. Afterward, they climbed to the top of the island, but found nothing there except dry, already withered grass and various low shrubs. Among them, a large number of quails, completely similar to the European kind, had made their home. Some deep and narrow crevices, running from the heights down to the sea, were overgrown with trees, bushes, and vines, and filled with small birds, including falcons. Where the cliffs rose vertically from the ocean, or leaned steeply over the water, large flocks of a beautiful kind of shag had nested, either on small rock ledges, or, where possible, in little hollows. These hollows were about 1 foot square, and sometimes seemed to have been widened by the birds themselves. The clay-like rock forming most of the mountains in Charlotte Sound was often soft enough for this. It lay in slanted layers, usually dipping toward the south, and came in greenish-gray, blue, or yellow-brown colors, occasionally containing quartz veins. They also found green talc stone, called lapis nephriticus, which when hard enough was semi-transparent and could be finely polished. However, there were far more soft, opaque, pale green types than the flint-hard, translucent ones. The local people used this stone to make chisels, axes, and sometimes war clubs called patu-patu. It was the same stone known to English jewelers as jade.
Lapis nephriticus, better known as Nephri jade, holds a unique and deeply rooted significance in Aotearoa, present-day New Zealand. Known to the Māori as Pounamu and often referred to as greenstone in English, this mineral is far more than a beautiful green rock. It is a cultural treasure, a spiritual symbol, a marker of identity, and a material deeply intertwined with history, tradition, and power. Pounamu is found only in specific rivers and rock deposits on New Zealand's South Island, particularly in the West Coast region. It is prized for its hardness, durability, and distinctive green hues. Māori classifications such as Kawakawa, Inanga, Kahurangi, and Tangiwai describe the various colors and degrees of translucency found in different types of jade. Beyond its physical qualities, Pounamu has long been considered a taonga, a sacred treasure infused with mana, the spiritual force that can be inherited, earned, or embodied by an object or a person. Traditionally, Pounamu was used to craft tools, weapons, and personal adornments such as chisels, short clubs, fish hooks, and pendants. These objects were not only functional but often deeply symbolic, carrying ancestral meaning and serving as heirlooms passed down through generations. To give or receive a piece of Pounamu was to establish or honor a relationship. It symbolized trust, alliance, or remembrance. During the period of European exploration and colonization, Pounamu became a highly valued trade item. Observers like James Cook and Georg Forster noted how Māori were willing to exchange intricately carved greenstone items for metal tools and glass beads. Yet while the Europeans admired the beauty of the stone, they often failed to understand its cultural depth and sacred importance.
Next to it, they found layers of a black rock made of dense black mica and small quartz particles. Various types of hornstone and slate also appeared in thick layers. Especially common was clay slate, usually found in broken pieces along the shore. The sailors called it shingle, as noted in Captain Cook's earlier voyage account. It often looked rusty, likely from iron particles. From these minerals, it was reasonable to suspect that this part of New Zealand contained iron, and possibly other ores. On the beach, they collected various types of flint and pebbles, and also some pieces of dense, heavy black basalt. The natives also made their patu from this basalt. Finally, shortly before departure, they found a few pieces of whitish pumice along the shore. These, along with the basalt lava, were undeniable evidence that New Zealand must either still have or once had volcanoes.
Sunday, May 23rd, 1773, Queen Charlotte Sound.
In the morning, 2 small canoes approached, carrying 5 indigenous men. They were the first to appear since the arrival. They resembled the people from Dusky Bay, but seemed less suspicious and anxious from the start. The crew bought fish from them and gave them some gifts. The men had no hesitation boarding the ship and even followed into the cabin. As the officers sat down to eat, they joined them at the table and ate without concern. However, when it came to drinking, they refused wine or spirits, showing a strong aversion. They drank only water, especially when it was sweetened with sugar, which they loved. They were restless and left the table to head below deck, where they enjoyed another large meal with the officers and drank more sweetened water. They took anything they could reach, but as soon as it was indicated that something was not to be taken, they returned it willingly. Glass bottles, called taha, seemed especially valuable to them. Whenever they spotted one, they pointed at it and said "muck," while placing a hand on their chest, signaling a wish to have it. They showed no interest in white paper or similar trinkets, but iron, nails, and axes were greatly appreciated, a sign that they had come to understand the practical value and durability of metal goods. Their previous indifference during Cook's earlier voyage had clearly been due to unfamiliarity. Some of the sailors had taken the liberty of using the canoes to go ashore. The indigenous men, displeased with this boldness, came straight to the cabin to complain to the captain. This showed they understood that the captain held authority. Cook immediately ensured justice by ordering the canoes returned. The men left in high spirits, satisfied with the resolution. Early the next morning, they returned at daybreak and brought 4 more people, including a woman and several children. They seemed to have come for trade, which no one wanted to disturb. After breakfast, the captains of both ships rowed out with Georg to a wide inlet on the north side of the sound. It had been named West Bay during the previous voyage. On the way, they encountered a double canoe with 13 men on board. These men seemed to recognize Captain Cook. They spoke directly to him and asked about Tupaya, the Polynesian from Otaheite, who had been with him on the earlier journey and had still been alive when the ship had last visited New Zealand. When they learned that Tupaya had died, they appeared deeply saddened and expressed a few words in a mournful tone.
Tupaya was a high-ranking Tahitian priest and navigator who played a key role during Captain Cook's first voyage around the world aboard the Endeavour. Born around 1725 on the island of Raiatea, he was well-versed in Polynesian navigation, culture, and religious knowledge. Tupaya joined Cook's expedition in 1769 when the ship stopped in Tahiti. His ability to navigate vast ocean distances without European instruments impressed the British crew, and he quickly became a vital intermediary between them and the Polynesian peoples they encountered. Tupaya's importance extended beyond navigation. He acted as translator, cultural guide, and diplomat, helping Cook establish peaceful contact with many Pacific Island communities. He also created a map that displayed over 130 islands known to Polynesian navigators, showing the vast extent of Polynesian seafaring knowledge. When the Endeavour reached New Zealand later that year, Tupaya was instrumental in communicating with the Māori. Because of shared linguistic roots and cultural connections across Polynesia, the Māori could partially understand his Tahitian language. This common ground helped ease tensions and facilitated dialogue between the British and the indigenous people. Although Tupaya died in Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta, in 1770 from disease before Cook's first voyage ended, his legacy lived on. During Cook's second voyage in 1773, when the Resolution anchored in Queen Charlotte Sound, some Māori remembered Tupaya. They spoke of Tupaya, who had come years earlier with another great ship. This showed how strongly his visit had impacted the Māori and how word of his presence had spread and endured. Tupaya remains a symbol of cultural exchange and indigenous agency in the age of exploration.
They were signaled to go to the ship in Ship Cove, but when they saw the group heading in another direction, they turned back to the bay from which they had come. They found the mountains in this part of the land not quite as steep as those at the southern end of New Zealand. Especially along the coast, the mountains were all lower than there, yet almost entirely covered in forest, just as dense and impenetrable as in Dusky Bay. However, there were far more pigeons, parrots, and small birds here, some of which might have left the colder regions in winter and migrated to this warmer part. Oyster catchers and various species of shags made the coast lively, but ducks were rare. West Bay offered many beautiful coves, all with good anchoring ground. All around, the hills rose in gentle slopes and were covered in shrubs and trees. Yet some peaks were treeless, instead growing a kind of common fern. The landscape looked similar on various islands in the Sound and along much of the southeastern coast, from Cape Koamaru toward East Bay. After collecting many new plants, including one pepper species that tasted almost like ginger, and shooting various birds, they returned to the ship late in the evening. While they had been away, a large canoe with 12 indigenous men had arrived from the north. These men had traded many of their garments, some stone battle axes, clubs, spears, and even their paddles. The large boat that had been sent that morning to a nearby bay to gather vegetables for the crew and grass for the goats and sheep had not yet returned to the ship when they got back. And since it remained absent the next day, they became deeply worried about the 12 men aboard. Among them were the third ship's lieutenant, the marine lieutenant, Mr. Hodges, the carpenter, and the constable. They had all the more reason to fear the worst about their absence, since neither wind nor weather could be blamed. Both had remained perfectly fine until the morning of the 25th, when it finally began to rain and storm.
Wednesday, May 26, 1773, Ship Cove, Queen Charlotte Sound.
In the afternoon, when the weather began to clear a little, the missing boat finally returned. But the men were utterly exhausted from work and hunger. Their entire food supply had consisted of 3 ship's biscuits and a bottle of brandy, and because of the stormy weather, they hadn't been able to catch a single fish. They had fought with all their strength against the waves to return to the ship, but had been unable to overcome the fury of the sea. After being tossed about for a while, they had taken refuge in a bay, where a few abandoned huts left by the indigenous people had to serve as shelter. Still, they had nearly starved, as their only sustenance had been a few shellfish they scraped off the rocks here and there. The next morning, they walked along the edge of the bay, looking for plants and birds. In the afternoon, they headed to the rocky coast of Point Jackson to shoot shags, which they had learned to eat instead of wild ducks. Meanwhile, the same Maori family that had visited them on the 23rd came by again. This time, however, they seemed only interested in joining the meal, as they had brought nothing to trade. They asked for their names, but it took a long time until the visitors understood what was meant. Eventually, they learned that the oldest among them was called Toahangha, and the others were Kotukai, Kogoa, Koa, Kolak, and Taiwaherua. The last was a boy of about 14 years. He had a very pleasing nature and seemed to be the liveliest and most intelligent of the group. They took him to the cabin and kept him at the table, where he ate heartily. Among other things, he devoured a piece of shag pie with such a greedy appetite that it surprised them. Unexpectedly, he preferred the pastry to the meat. The captain poured him some Madeira wine, of which he drank a little more than 1 glass, though he made many sour and twisted faces at first. Later, they offered him a glass of very sweet Cape wine. He liked it so much, he licked his lips non-stop, and soon asked for a second glass, which he received. Then he became extremely lively and talkative. He danced around the cabin and suddenly wanted the captain's boat cloak, which lay on a chair. When told no, he became irritated. Not long after, he asked for an empty bottle. When denied again, he ran out of the cabin in a rage. On deck, he found some of the servants folding linen that had been drying. He quickly grabbed a tablecloth, but it was taken back from him immediately. Now he lost all self-control. He stomped his feet, made threats, grumbled, or rather growled, through his teeth, and finally became so sulky he wouldn't speak at all. This boy's behavior showed clearly how sensitive and easily offended these people could be. It also confirmed how fortunate it was that they didn't know intoxicating drinks. Such things would surely make them even more wild and unruly. The next morning, several canoes surrounded them, carrying about 30 Maori in total. They brought various tools and weapons to trade, and received many other items in return, as the sailors were so eager to barter that one constantly outbid the other. Among them were also some women. These had painted their cheeks with red ochre and oil, but their lips appeared bluish-black from tattooing, which was very fashionable in this land. They observed that, like the people in Dusky Bay, most of them had thin, bowed legs with thick knees. This was likely due to disuse, spending much time lying idly on land and always sitting with crossed legs in the canoes. Otherwise, their skin tone was relatively light, somewhere between olive and mahogany brown. Their hair was pitch black, their faces round, with rather thick than flat noses and lips. They had black eyes that were often lively and expressive, and their upper bodies were well-shaped. Overall, their appearance was not at all unpleasant to the eye. Since leaving the Cape, the sailors had had no contact with women. They now pursued these eagerly, and the way their advances were received showed clearly that chastity was not strictly observed here, and that romantic conquests were not likely to be difficult. But the favors of these women did not depend solely on their own inclination. The men, as absolute masters, had to be asked first. If their consent was purchased with a large nail, a shirt, or something similar, the women then had the freedom to do whatever they wished with their lovers, and could also ask for a gift for themselves. However, Georg had to admit that some of these women allowed themselves to be used for such shameful acts only with the greatest reluctance. The men often had to exert their full authority, sometimes even using threats, before they could force them to yield to the desires of such fellows who, without feeling, could watch their tears and hear their cries. Whether the sailors, who wanted to be seen as civilized, but could behave so beastly, or those so-called savages, who forced their own women into such disgrace, deserved the greater disgust. This was a question Georg did not wish to answer. Since the New Zealanders realized that they could obtain iron tools no more cheaply or easily than through this degrading trade, they soon roamed all over the ship and offered their daughters and sisters without distinction. However, married women were, as far as the visitors could observe, never permitted to associate with the sailors in such a manner. Their understanding of female chastity differed so greatly from European ideas that an unmarried girl could favor many lovers without losing her honor in the slightest. But once she married, the strictest fidelity was expected of her. Since they placed no value on the abstinence of unmarried women, one might suppose that contact with promiscuous Europeans had not worsened the moral character of this people. Yet there was every reason to believe that the New Zealanders had only lowered themselves to such shameful trafficking in women since new needs had been introduced among them by iron tools. Once these needs existed, they first resorted, just to satisfy them, to actions they might never have conceived before, and which, according to European concepts, bore not even a trace of honor or sensitivity. It was already misfortune enough that so many innocent people had to lose their lives as a result of these discoveries. Yet, harsh as that may have been for the small and unrefined tribes encountered by Europeans, it was truly nothing compared to the irreparable harm caused by the destruction of their moral principles. Had that evil been somewhat compensated by teaching them truly useful things, or by eradicating some immoral and harmful habit among them, then at least one might have found comfort in the thought that they had gained something on one side for what they lost on the other. But Georg feared sadly that their contact had brought nothing but disadvantage to the inhabitants of the South Seas. He believed that the peoples who had fared best were precisely those who had always kept their distance and, out of fear and mistrust, never allowed the sailors to grow too familiar with them. If only all of them, at all times, had read in the sailors' expressions and behavior the frivolity and debauchery so rightfully attributed to seafaring men. They brought some of these islanders into the cabin, where Mr. Hodges took great care to sketch those whose faces carried the most character. To that end, they tried to keep the men still for a few moments by showing them small trinkets and giving them some as gifts. There were especially a few elderly men with gray hair, as well as some younger individuals whose features displayed remarkable expression. The younger ones had thick, tousled hair falling across their faces, which heightened their naturally fierce appearance. Nearly all of them were of medium height. In build, complexion, and clothing, they resembled the people of Dusky Bay almost entirely. Their garments were woven from the fibers of the flax plant, but were never adorned with feathers. Instead, the corners of their cloaks were trimmed with pieces of dog fur, an ornament not seen in Dusky Bay, where dogs were absent. Because of the late season, when the weather had already begun to turn cold and rainy, the men almost always wore their bogie, a rough cloak made of bundled straw hanging from the neck down over the shoulders. Their other cloth garments were typically old, dirty, and not as finely crafted as those described in the account of Captain Cook's earlier voyage. The men wore their hair loosely hanging around their heads, while the women had it cut short, an apparent custom consistently observed among them. They also wore the headdresses made of brown feathers, just as described in Captain Cook's previous voyage. After spending a couple of hours aboard, they began to steal, trying to hide away anything they could get their hands on. Some were caught attempting to sneak off with a 4-hour sandglass, a lamp, several handkerchiefs, and knives. Because of this thievery, the captain had them thrown off the ship and told they were never to come aboard again. They clearly understood the shame of such treatment, and their fiery temper, unable to endure any insult, flared up. One of them even shouted threats from his canoe, as if he might resort to violence. But nothing came of it. That evening, all of them quietly went ashore, and directly opposite the ship, built a few shelters out of tree branches to spend the night. They pulled their canoes onto the beach, lit a fire, and prepared dinner. Fish they had skillfully caught using a woven net not far from the shore. Both the net and their method of using it had already been described during Cook's earlier voyage. The next morning, they sailed to Long Island in calm, mild weather to check on the hay their men had made there 8 days earlier. Near an abandoned native settlement, they also planned to gather vegetables for the ship's crew. During this trip, Georg and his companions discovered some new plants and shot a few small birds that were unlike any species they had seen before. In the afternoon, the captain allowed several sailors to go ashore. There, they traded various curiosities with the natives and eagerly sought the attention of several young women without minding the extreme filth these women lived in. Had the sailors not all but abandoned any sense of feeling, the women's repulsive custom of smearing their cheeks with ochre and oil might have been enough to deter such familiar contact. In addition, the New Zealand women smelled so bad that one could often sense their presence from a distance. They were also so infested with vermin that they frequently picked lice from their clothes and cracked them between their teeth. It was astonishing that men could stoop to such bestial acts with such repulsive creatures, and that neither their own sense of decency nor the Englishman's traditional education in cleanliness stirred any disgust for these people. Before they returned to the ship, one of the women had stolen a sailor's jacket and given it to a young man from her people. The owner found it in the hands of that fellow and took it back. In response, the local struck him with a few punches, which the Englishman at first took as a joke. But as he turned around to climb into the boat, the islander hurled large stones at him. That was the moment the sailor lost his temper. He charged at the man and began to box him in proper English fashion. Within seconds, the New Zealander had a black eye and a bloody nose, and apparently enough. Terrified, he gave up the fight and ran off. Captain Cook had resolved to take every possible care to ensure that European garden plants would thrive in this land. For that purpose, he had the soil prepared, scattered various seeds, and later transplanted the young plants to 4 or 5 different spots around the sound. One such plot he established on the shore of Long Island, another on the Hippa Rock, 2 more on Motu Aro, and a 5th on a fairly large piece of land at the back of Ship Cove, where their ships lay anchored. He focused especially on useful and nourishing root crops, above all on potatoes, of which they had been fortunate to obtain some fresh ones. He also sowed several kinds of grain, as well as broad beans, runner beans, and peas. During the final days of their stay, he devoted himself almost entirely to this work.
This concludes part 17 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of James Cook. I have linked a map of the locations of this episode in the show notes. For those who would like to see the locations of the journey around the world on the present day, I recommend my YouTube channel, Voyage to Go. There, I visit the places from Georg Forster's travel narrative and try to uncover traces and connections between today and the past. So that was episode 17 of our journey around the world with Georg Forster, Captain Cook and the HMS Resolution, on which we will continue our travels together in the coming weeks. I hope we can travel a little further together, because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.